Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Caroline Segal. I'm one of the licensed psychologists here at SASCO. My primary clinical focus is in parent coaching work. I do some individual therapy with teens and adults as well, but most of what I do is working with parents. And parent coaching work is, individualized to every family, but largely ends up focusing on identifying and establishing the kind of relationships you want to have in your home, the kind of behaviors you want to support, the values you want to espouse in your household. And when an email blast went out a couple weeks ago from Lisa Doby, who's helping facilitate this talk, about the upcoming parenting series being focused on the 3 C's: curiosity, compassion, and connection, immediately my mind went to this phrase, positive parenting. I'm sure many of you have heard of it, kind of a fad phenomenon of the past probably decade or so. And it's this great ideology that's all about, how to use positive attention and intention to support your child, support your family. And I also get a pit in my stomach whenever I hear the phrase positive parenting, because I get countless parents coming in to meet with me who say, listen, I've tried this. I've read all these articles. I've listened to all these podcasts. I do all the strategies, and it seems like it's going great until I mess something up, or my child is just too much for me and I end up yelling when I don't want to be yelling, and then I fail. And that is what puts a pit in my stomach, is that any parent who is trying to do something good for their family walks away feeling like they've failed, because that in and of itself is antithetical to the spirit of positive parenting. So that's why I want to do this talk today. I want us to talk about what this kind of really means, how this could really look in your home, and how you can kind of tailor it to the realities of who you are as a person, who your family is, and not feel like you have to follow a prescription, but more just understanding what matters to you and what are the things you want to try out. So take what you want and leave what you don't. That's my advice. There we go. So here's what we're going to do today. I'm going to kind of quickly talk a little bit about the spirit behind positive parenting and get a little scientific about, if we're thinking about behaviors that we want to encourage in yourself, in your child, in your family system, how do we do that scientifically? We're going to go inward. And this is, I think, the most important part of the journey, is getting introspective and thinking about, what are the things that you're not happy with right now in your family system? And let's understand why that's happening, not judging it, but just understanding it, so that we can figure out what changes are realistic and can actually work for you. And then I'm going to give some general strategies that a lot of people find to be helpful. But what's more important to me than anything is that you walk away learning how to look inward at yourself and your family and figure some of these things out for yourself. And hopefully some of the strategies I share will be a part of that journey. So in thinking about what positive parenting means, it's really loosely defined, but I think the spirit is really around parenting with kindness, respect, empathy, and intention. I'm going to repeat these a few times as we talk: kindness, respect, empathy, intention. That's the goal behind everything. It's really not that there is a prescribed way to do this. It's just that everything you do as a parent, you strive to do it from a place of kindness, respect, empathy, and intention, which again is why this concept came to mind when thinking about connection, compassion, and curiosity, because I feel like all of that kind of goes together in one pretty nice bundle. What positive parenting isn't, and this is often, where parents feel like they've failed, is in these 3 things. It is not the lack of all consequences and discipline. To be a positive parent, to embody the spirit of the philosophy, does not mean that you can't have any control of your household, that you can't give out punishments. It doesn't mean that you can't give timeouts. It doesn't mean that you can't yell. It's about looking at some of those behaviors from your end and figuring out where you can kind of bolster them with kindness, respect, empathy, intention. A perfect example from my own house this morning: I am absolutely a parent who sometimes yells at my kids. I would love to yell less, and I'm human. And how we embody respect and kindness in our home is that my daughter, I have one child who's old enough to talk, and she will call me out if I'm yelling in an inappropriate way. And it gives us a chance to come back together and connect, and I can kind of reset and make a different choice. However, yelling is allowed under one circumstance, which is when something dangerous is happening. So when she's shoving my toddler, as was happening this morning, and I yell, I get to do that because it is kind, respectful, empathic, and most importantly, intentional to get their attention and get them to stop. So that's an example of how, some of these things we might think of as not being okay in positive parenting actually are okay. Anything is okay. It's just about the mindset and the approach and intentionality behind it. Most importantly, positive parenting is not about being perfect. I love this quote for that reason. There is no such thing as a perfect parent, despite what Instagram might try to tell you. It's just not real. In fact, the research shows that good enough parenting, meaning being a human who messes up and just does your best to pick yourself up and keep going the next day in your parenting journey, yields much more resilient kids than the parents who somehow manage to make it seem like they're doing everything right all the time. So with that, I've told you the spirit behind positive parenting, largely rooted, again, in kindness, respect, empathy, and intention. But what I care about so much more than that is for everybody listening to this talk to figure out what values are the most meaningful to you. You as a person, your family, what are the values you want your kids to learn to live by? And what are the values that you want to guide the choices that you make in your parenting, in your relationships, in your work? So I want you to just take a second and scan this not comprehensive list. If you think of a value off this list that is meaningful to you, fantastic. But just grab a couple terms and hold them in your mind so that when we talk about strategies and approaches, you can think about, okay, well, if my value that means the most to me is honesty or respect or fairness, then how do I let that guide the way that I approach these tough situations that come across my day constantly? So holding those in mind, this is where I'm a scientist at heart. We're going to get a little scientific for a minute. When we think about the behaviors that we want to promote and the patterns that we want to establish in our family, it's important to think about how we shift behaviors. So for those of you unfamiliar with the terminology of operant conditioning, this is a learning theory that basically explains how some behaviors increase in frequency and how some decrease. So we increase behaviors through reinforcement. Reinforcement is basically anything that happens that makes a behavior happen more often. Largely, it yields something that feels good, but not even necessarily. Because what we know with kids in particular is kids have a need for attention. Everybody does, but kids are most likely to show that need to you as the parent. And they will take any kind of attention, positive or negative. So when we think about positive reinforcement, which is any stimulus that increases the frequency of a behavior, we often think about the good stuff, like when you get a compliment on the great job you did on a report for your boss, and it makes you feel good. So the next time you're assigned a report, you work just as hard. It increases the frequency of your good work ethic. A positive attention from you, the parent, is a great reinforcer for your kids. The problem is that negative attention from you is also reinforcing. So if your kid is the kind who tests limits and pushes boundaries and tries to see if they can get a rise out of you, and they do, they've gotten that attention, that reinforces it, and that behavior increases. So that's positive reinforcement. My favorite example of negative reinforcement, which is where you're removing something unpleasant and that feels good and it makes you do the behavior more, is if you think about a car alarm and the sound of that car alarm going off, that's so annoying, and it makes you pull out the keys from your pocket and press the button to make the alarm go off. You feel better, everything's fine, you go about your day. Next time you hear a car alarm, you may not even realize how conditioned you are. The first thing you probably do, even if it's down the street, is you reach for your pocket for that button because you've been conditioned to do what it takes to make that noise stop. Negative reinforcement is one that I find often comes up with parents. We are so negatively reinforced by our children. If they learn to whine or cry or shout or melt down until we give in on something or cave in some way, we are negatively reinforced by that behavior to do whatever it takes to make it stop. So that's reinforcement. Punishment is anything that decreases the frequency of a behavior. So positive punishment is applying something unpleasant. Think somebody dines and dashes and they get caught and they get sent in the kitchen to wash dishes and it's humiliating and they never dine and dash again. Or negative punishment is where you're taking away something pleasant to decrease a behavior, like you break curfew and your parent takes away your iPad for a couple days. I just want to clarify that all of these reinforcement patterns and punishment patterns, all of them are welcome within the spirit of positive parenting, so long as they're done intentionally, respectfully, empathically, kindly. In this talk, I'm mostly going to focus on reinforcement, which is not to say that you can't use punishments, you can't use timeouts or loss of privilege or anything like that. Those are totally fine. I'm just going to focus more on reinforcement. Because as we think about behaviors, I like to think about, not just the behaviors that we want to change, but also the behaviors that we want to promote. And the key in figuring out what behaviors to promote and how to go about it is to recognize that all behaviors have a function. If your child is whining or demanding for their breakfast in the morning, there's some reason that they're going to that behavior versus another one. And we have to think about what is the need that that behavior is trying to meet. And if we can identify that need, then we can think about what are the reinforcing factors that keep your child going to that way of asking for their breakfast. Why are they doing it that way instead of any other way? What is maintaining it? How do you respond? How does the environment respond that keeps that behavior as the go-to? And the same goes for yourself. If you come home at the end of the day and everyone's nagging at you and you just, kind of shut down and you're just like, I'm overloaded. That's it. I'm shut down. I don't hear anything anymore. What need is that behavior helping to meet? And how can we think about what keeps you shutting down in those moments? Then more importantly, let's go back to your values. Think about from a values-based perspective, how do you want your child to be asking for their breakfast? How do you want to handle those really stressful moments at the end of the day? What are the behaviors that you would like to see that feel more in line with your values? And that's why this is really personal and takes introspection, because it really is individual to all of you, thinking about if you value respect, if you value family, if you value contributing, then what are the behaviors that kind of match with those values? And then if we think about why those behaviors aren't happening more, let's think about if there's anything getting in the way. Is there anything that's helping you to rise up above the overwhelm? And with that understanding of your own behaviors, of your child's behaviors, we can start to pinpoint really specifically what are the things that need to change for you to feel like things are moving in the direction you want them to move. So the way that I do that kind of analysis of figuring out what can we experiment with, what can we change, is the ABC model, antecedent, behavior, consequence. So take any behavior that you're trying to understand and think about antecedent, what comes before that kind of triggers that behavior or gets somebody into a pattern where the behavior is likely to come out. Maybe things are going great and you're holding it together and you're staying super calm, but something happens that gets you to yell. And that's the moment that you're like, I failed, I'm not doing positive parenting. What was the antecedent? What was the final straw? And let's figure out what we can change there. Then comes the behavior, then after is the consequence. What comes after? The consequence is something that's going to reinforce the behavior. When we talk about negative reinforcement, it may be, we'll talk about this in a second, but there's something that you're doing to stop your child from doing something really annoying that works, even if it's not what you'd rather do, if it's not aligned with your values, but it works and it gives you the moment of reprieve, and so it gets reinforced. So we think about the consequence, what maintains the behavior. And as you go through this model for yourself, for your child, and think about your own antecedents and consequences, two things to keep in mind is it's really important to do this curiously. This is not about shaming yourself for behaviors that you wish you weren't engaging in or self-flagellating or anything like that. And it's not about shaming your child. It's about understanding. Secondly, we largely respond to behaviors with consequences, right? We see something come up and then we do something after. So it's easy to think about what can I change in my response to a situation, but a lot of times we actually see more change when we shift the antecedent. So wherever possible, I always think about the antecedent first and then loop in the consequences after. So a quick and dirty example of what all of this means. So really simple scenario, let's say you're going to the grocery store with your child and they see candy in the candy aisle. And what do? Their behavior is they whine and whine and whine because they think that's going to get them candy. Maybe they're really good at it and you end up caving, you buy them the candy, and their behavior is reinforced. If we look at the ABC for the parent, then the trigger here, the antecedent, is the child whining. which is both grating and annoying and also makes us feel like people are looking at us and judging us, and we don't want to make a scene. So we just buy the candy. We tell ourselves it's just this one time. It's just like, we can't handle this right now. We buy the candy. The consequence is the whining stops. Everybody feels better. Everyone's behavior is reinforced. And the next time that dyad goes to the grocery store, probably same thing's going to happen. If we think about things you want to change, maybe you're thinking, okay, let's change the consequence. Easy. I just won't buy the candy. Maybe that works. That'd be great. And what happens to a lot of kids is if they're used to getting the candy, when they whine and they don't get the candy, they're going to up their game. They're going to start screaming and shouting and throwing things, throwing themselves on the floor, holding their breath till they pass out, whatever it takes for you to be like, and I'm done. I'm buying the candy. So you could change the consequence, and it's a tough road. If you think about antecedents, maybe you avoid that aisle so they don't see the candy in the first place. Maybe you make sure they're well fed, so maybe they don't think about asking for candy. Maybe you set the expectations ahead of time that you're going to go to the store and not buy candy, so everyone's on the same page. And that all has a shot of working. But this is where I want you to really get in touch with your value. If you think about the values that are most important to you to instill and espouse, maybe a value of yours is respect. And if you think about it, maybe the problem isn't even so much the candy. Maybe it's more about the behavior, the approach to get the candy. Maybe if your child asks for a piece of candy respectfully, maybe that's not a big deal to you. For some parents, maybe yes, but for some parents, it may be that we're asking ourselves kind of the wrong question. So it could be that maybe the antecedent is setting the expectation with your child. Hey, if you ask me really kindly or really respectfully for a piece of candy, then I'm happy to get that for you to thank you for helping me with my errands. And then they engage in the more, values-based appropriate behavior, and you buy them the candy and everybody feels better. It's like the same outcome to the story, but this time it's based in intention and it's based in your value. So that's the kind of thinking that I want you guys to do as you consider what kind of patterns are coming up in your family and what changes you're looking to make. We're going to talk about strategies to use both with yourself and with your children, but I want to start with you as the parent. And the reason that I want to start there is twofold. One, at the end of the day, we don't have a whole lot of control over other people. A lot of parent coaching work is figuring out how to help change children's behaviors, but that's not really up to us to force our children to do any one thing or another. We just make our best efforts and hope. The person you have the most control over, though still not full control, is yourself. So it's often easiest to start with what behaviors can you change in yourself to, have the kind of relationships and patterns that you want in your home. And then we can think about how to incorporate the kids into the picture. The other reason, sliding down to the second bullet point, that it helps to start with you is the concept of mirror neurons, which basically show that the same parts of our brain are activated when we perform an action as when we see someone else perform an action. Now, if you think about how this relates to parenting, if your value is respect, then maybe you're the kind of parent who tells your kids, you got to say please and thank you and ask nicely and you tell them all the rules of etiquette. But if that child hears their parent in the real world getting snippy on the phone with a customer service person or snapping at their spouse or doing something that maybe isn't in line with the behavior, with the value, then what do you think the child's going to learn more from? What they see or what you're telling them to do. So that's why it helps. And this is why it's really important to be non-judgmental with yourself, because we're all human and we all have our areas of need of growth. But what can we do to help support you in living by your values so that your kids learn to do that too? So in doing so, it's helpful really to do the ABC model on yourself. Think about what's going on for you. What are the settings in which the behaviors that you're showing do align with your values? Where are you respectful with other people or kind or, whatever's important to you? And what are the settings where your behaviors contradict your values, where you look back and you think, God, I wish I didn't do that. Again, no judgment here. Let's be honest. When it happens, there's some unmet need that you have that is getting in the way of you behaving the way that you want to behave, behaving the way you want your kids to learn how to behave. So let's figure out what that need is. And let's figure out what change can be made in your environment to better support you so that your behaviors and your values line up. So a few broad things to hold in mind when we think about the parent as a model. things that a lot of parents want their kids to learn more generally, and that a lot of parents have trouble doing for themselves. Celebrating your virtues. We tell our kids all the time how proud we are of them, and adults, for some reason, have a hard time, feeling proud of themselves. So own it, own those good things, and your kids will learn to do it too. Admit your mistakes. Everybody is human, and mistakes are really valuable. We learn more from our mistakes than we do from the things that we do right, because the mistakes stand out to us. That feeling of shame or guilt, that uncomfortable feeling, we don't like it. So it makes us want to change our behavior and do something differently the next time. That's actually helpful and productive. So if you can embrace that process, take accountability for your mistakes, make amends, and importantly, figure out how to forgive yourself, and so you can move on, then that's what your kids learn to do too. Another one parents struggle to do is take time for themselves. A lot of parents, and I'm guilty of this too, feel like every minute we have with our kids, we need to be doing whatever we can for them. And then your kids don't see that actually it's good to be alone sometimes, and it's good to take care of yourself and make time for yourself and prioritize yourself too. Another big one is turning to others for help. A lot of people who come to therapy for the first time say, I put this off for so long because it made me feel weak. And the reality is, turning to somebody for help, whether it be a therapist, a friend, a neighbor, whoever, it makes you strong, because it makes you resourceful, and it helps you get needs met that help you, behave in ways that are more aligned with your values. So it's a great one to model for your kids. And the last one that I'll come back to again later is that all feelings are valid. All feelings have a purpose. Another thing a lot of parents come to me say they try to do is they try never to let their kids see them be sad or angry or have any kind of uncomfortable emotion. And they try to just kind of bottle it all up. The reality is that it's important for kids to see that those feelings are okay, because that means it's okay for your kids to have them too. That feelings are information. They tell us that something isn't feeling quite right, something's feeling off, and then helps us look inward and figure out what do we need to do to feel better moving forward. So with that, now I'm going to dive into more of the specific strategies that are helpful for a lot of parents as they're going through the ABCs for their own families. And going way back for antecedents, I like to think not just about what happens immediately before a behavior, but even, a day before, a week before, all the inputs that might make us vulnerable to behaving in ways that we maybe wouldn't behave ideally. And one thing that parents often struggle with is getting their basic needs met so that they have the wherewithal to get through the tough moments. So when I think about basic needs, I think of dialectical behavior therapy is an approach that has a lot of beautiful little acronyms of skills. And one of them is please skills, which basically means treat any physical illnesses you have, do your best to balance your eating. I can't tell you how many times I have an appointment with a parent at like 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and they're like, oh my God, what time it is? Did I even get on the right link? I haven't had anything to eat all day. I just realized that. Like, often parents are just running around trying to get things done, and you forget to eat. But eating is a big part of helping your body stay regulated and having the energy and the attention to be able to do all the things you need to do. So do your best to prioritize things like that: your physical illness, your eating, avoiding mood altering drugs to the extent possible, depending on your children's ages, getting good sleep, getting moderate exercise. That's important. Another thing that we talk about a lot in parenting is this concept of co-regulation. Any of you on this talk who come to meet with our esteemed occupational therapists probably hear about regulation all the time, and how when we are dysregulated, when we're in a state of fight or flight or arousal, we can't access our thinking brain, the part of our brain that makes good decisions and thinks things through and thinks about other people, and all of that is totally shut down when you're in a state of arousal. And so our goal with our kids when they're dysregulated is first and foremost to regulate them. And the most powerful tool we have as parents to regulate our children is what's called co-regulation, which is basically you serving as the regulator with your child. Key example: when a baby is crying and they're totally helpless and they can't do anything to help themselves, what's your instinct? You pick up that baby, you put them to your chest, you go shh, 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 in low, calm, soothing tones. And when they're pressed against you and their little heartbeats are going crazy, your heartbeat is calm. and their heartbeat starts to match yours after a couple minutes. You are regulating their tiny little body. And that's a job that parents play throughout a child's life. I still, as an adult, when I am dysregulated, I call my mother and she co-regulates me over the phone. We do this forever. It looks different, but some of those same tools, like if your child is starting to yell and their voice is modulating up, if you get a little quieter than you maybe typically would talk, eventually you kind of anchor them and they might come back down to you. So it's a really powerful skill for you to be regulated when your child is dysregulated. And it's also really hard to do because we get dysregulated by dysregulated people. So that's why one of the best antecedents you can do for yourself to help you in those tough moments is fill your own regulation buckets as much as you can throughout the day before things get tough. So a lot of little tips that parents try, that a lot of parents come to me and talk about, are things like setting aside 5 minutes between when your workday ends and when your kids get off the bus. That's just for you to kind of mentally prepare for the witching hour to come. Taking short walks both throughout the day just to kind of get that input, and also when things start to heat up so that you can do your best to be the calm that you want to see in the family. Things like drinking cold water, eating crunchy snacks, chewing gum, and kind of activating those sensory systems that help to regulate you. Imagining you have one of those little airport metal detectors and scanning your body head to toe and starting to notice, okay, what parts of me are tense, what's loose, what's hot, what's cold, what feels kind of fuzzy. If your shoulders are scrunched up to your ears and maybe you didn't notice until you took a second to pay attention, can you do some shoulder rolls, gentle massage, stretching, and just do something to tend to yourself? And that helps your whole system kind of cool down. Mindfulness meditation is kind of hugely touted to help with regulation. And if everyone had a half hour every day to do it, we'd all be doing great, but almost none of us have that kind of time. So I'm a big fan of fitting mindfulness into activities we're already doing 1 minute at a time. So basically the spirit of mindfulness is being present in the present moment and pushing aside your to-do list or whatever you're worried about, what's coming next, and just focusing on the sensory experiences you're having in that moment. So a mindful minute in the shower might look like taking the shampoo and really paying attention to what it feels like as you lather it in your hands, and paying attention to the smells that come as the lather builds, and what it feels like to inhale the hot, steamy air, and what it feels like to have the water like rushing over your body and all the sounds that go with it. Doing that for 1 minute can help regulate your system, and you can do it in the shower, washing dishes, walking the dog, wherever you're doing just kind of a simple task that doesn't take a lot of thought. You can take a minute to be really present, then you're giving yourself a real gift. The other thing we know about eliciting calming emotions is that music and smells are very deeply connected to our emotion systems, our emotional memories. So if you have calming songs or certain scents that make you feel at peace, that's another great way to get just a little hit of regulation. Okay, so that's ways to take care of yourself. Now let's think about how to set your child up for success. So repeating the first two, the please skills for yourself are equally important for your child, making sure that their physical illnesses are treated, that their eating is as balanced as you can manage to get them to be. It's not an easy task with kids of any age, that they're avoiding mood altering drugs, that they're engaging in good sleep practices. They're not up on their phone at 2 a.m. because then they are going to be a nightmare in the morning, that they're getting moderate exercise, thinking about how to, kind of take care of their regulatory systems as much as possible. And again, I'm repeating co-regulation, but I repeat it because it's that important. That is an antecedent that you always have at your disposal as long as you are regulated enough. If you give them that co-regulation up front, that keeps them steady in tough moments. And it's also something you can use as a consequence. If they're having a hard time with something and they're dysregulating, you can use your regulation to regulate them. Now, a really important antecedent that sometimes we kind of forget about is actually checking in to make sure that your kids have the skills to execute on the behavior you want them to be performing. A really common example is cleaning their room. If you ask a parent what it means to have a clean room, they're going to say something like, oh, well, simple. Make the bed, fold the laundry, put the laundry away, make sure all toys are on their shelves where they belong, etc., etc. And if you ask a child what a clean room is, they might say, I don't know, I can get to my bed from the door, so that's clean enough. And you're going to have totally separate expectations. A lot of kids who come to SASCO come for executive functioning challenges. So if that applies to your family, I want you to take a second and think about how executive functioning challenges could interfere with a seemingly simple task like cleaning your room. Cleaning your room requires skills like getting started and being motivated to do something that's not inherently fun, planning and organizing your approach to how you're going to clean your room, what task you're going to do first and how you're going to go about it, and not feeling overwhelmed by how much there is to do. Executive functioning kind of compromises all of those individual skills that are required to clean your room. So it's important to think about, what is your child's profile? How do they learn and what are their kind of areas of difficulty? And is there a skill that they're missing in order to do the behavior that would ideally help everybody get along better? So if that's the case, let's say your child does struggle with motivation, for example, then maybe cleaning your room, maybe the antecedent could be finding a way to make it more inherently fun, like making a bingo board of all the tasks they have to do. So there's something kind of playful about it, or shooting hoops with dirty laundry into a hamper, whatever you can do to kind of help them help fill in that gap of the skill that they don't inherently have, so that they're able to perform the activity and everybody's able to get the good feelings that come afterwards. Another good antecedent is setting the boundaries and the expectations ahead of time. And this is one that seems simple and obvious, but a lot of parents actually struggle to figure out what expectations feel right to set. And a lot of times I have parents asking me, like, what should I be doing? What should the screen time limits be? Or how do I kind of set these parameters for my child? And the honest answer is that a lot of those questions end up being based on the values that you identified earlier. If you value respect, for example, then maybe the expectation around how to get the breakfast in the morning, if your child is whining and demanding for the breakfast, then maybe it's setting the expectation that they need to ask kindly for breakfast, withholding your attention if they don't ask kindly, and then anytime they're being kind, being like, absolutely, I'm on it as soon as I can. This is not always easy, but structure, routine, and predictability are things we all thrive on. So wherever you can have that in place, it's just going to facilitate regulation and keep your child more in their thinking brain so that they can make good choices. You can make good choices. And lastly, a lot of times as a new skill is coming out, it doesn't get a lot of reinforcement because there aren't a lot of opportunities for it to show itself. So if there's a skill that you want your child or behavior you want them to be exhibiting more often, then sometimes it helps to be a little clever about how to create the opportunities for that skill to come out. Like, let's say you're working on your kids getting along better with each other, sibling relationships. And you might be able to kind of set up maybe fake little chores for your kids to do to help each other, so that you get to then reinforce after and say, that was so helpful. Thank you for being, doing this nice thing for your sister. Wherever you can create the opportunities for the behaviors to come out, then it gets more opportunities for reinforcement and happens more often. My favorite antecedent that I teach a lot of families, and I'm going to do the quick and dirty version today. So if you want to learn more, please reach out to me after. I'm happy to talk in more depth. But there is this skill called special time that comes from a treatment approach called parent-child interaction therapy, or PCIT, that has a whole host of evidence behind it. Tons of research showing that families that do special time every day have kids that are more compliant, have stronger relationships, are more regulated, getting through tough times, and basically everything good that you're looking for in your family. Research shows it can come from doing special time daily. And what special time looks like is it's this 5-minute period of time every day where you're one-on-one with your child. So if you have multiple children, it's 5 minutes per child, one-on-one. And in that time, the goal is to try to fill 2 buckets that every person has, and that children have a hard time getting filled, which is their bucket for attention and their bucket for control. So in this 5-minute period, your child is in charge. They get to pick whatever you're doing together. They get to guide the play, and your job is really just to follow along. You're not making any suggestions or guiding the play in any way. They are the conductors and you are riding along. So things we don't do in this 5-minute period of time are ask questions, give commands, or criticize or correct in any way that might be perceived as negative. Basically, we're avoiding anything that could cause any tension or conflict. So you just get this 5 minutes of pure bubbly goodness. And you might be wondering, why are questions bad? I ask questions all the time. Should I not ask questions? And the reality is questions are great in a lot of settings. The reason we don't ask questions during special time is because questions can sometimes be hidden commands. If you ask a child, oh, what color is that block? Or, oh, what are you going to do next? You're kind of obligating them to response. You're putting them in a position to respond, which can kind of inadvertently guide the play or cause some kind of tension if they don't know the answer or they're uncomfortable sharing for whatever reason. So just to make sure that everything is super positive goodness, we cut out all questions in this 5-minute period and save them all for a different time of day. So what do you do in that 5 minutes is the pride skills, because it spells out pride. Praise with specific compliments, labeled praise. This is great to do all day long, and we lay it on in special time, where the more specific you can get to the behavior you want to see, and even better is if you can connect it to the value you want to see. That's how you really reinforce the specific value. For example, saying things like, I love how patient you're being, or so kind of you to share, or it's so respectful of you to take turns with me. Things like that. You can kind of weave in the values and behaviors so that your kids see, this is what I'm doing really well, I'm going to do more of it. Next up is reflect what your child is saying. Basically, this means repeating them like you're a parrot. They say, I'm building a train, or I'm driving the train. You say, you're driving the train. They say, I'm making a tower. You say, oh, you're making a tower. You're repeating what they're saying because this gives them really intense attention. They're just like loaded with your attention because you're really watching and absorbing and delighting in everything they're doing. And it forces you to pay attention because you can't repeat something that you didn't hear. So you know that you're not thinking about your to-do list or checking your phone if you're really focused on repeating what they're saying. The I is for imitate what they're doing. So if they're driving a train, you're driving a train. If they're drawing a giraffe, you're drawing a giraffe. So you're really connected in this time. Next is describe what your child is doing. The skill is called behavior descriptions. And this is the one that feels a little weird to most parents because we don't usually talk like this. But basically, this is like being a sports commentator. He shoots, he scores. You're describing, narrating what your child is doing using you are statements. You are putting the red block on the green block. You are using a yellow crayon. You are drawing a picture of a tree. Whatever they're doing, you're describing. And again, the reason is it's helping give them all of this really intense attention from you. It helps sustain their attention on the task at hand, having someone describe it. It's really good for kids with executive functioning challenges because what we want them to learn to do is to kind of start to narrate in their own heads what they're doing to kind of keep them on track. So if it starts by coming externally from the parent, then they kind of learn that skill themselves of how to talk themselves through a task. And it's a really good way to redirect when things start to get a little bit nutty. So if your kids are starting to dysregulate or starting to kind of whine or complain or do something a little bit negative, sometimes you can kind of avert the attention from what the negative thing that's happening by describing anything positive. So if they're starting to whine, but they're still kind of drawing, you can be like, oh, you're scribbling a line. I see that you're doing this, you're doing that. And sometimes that can help redirect them and avoid the temper tantrum altogether. So I love that skill. And the last one, E, is be enthusiastic. Whatever you're doing, we want you to enjoy it, because otherwise it's not really quality time. So while your child does get to pick the activity and guide the play, you can also be intentional up front. If there's something that drives you nuts, if you hate mess, don't let slime be an option. Keep it to activities that you might enjoy so that you can have a good time together. And if any kind of minor misbehavior comes up during the play, your goal is to ignore it as much as possible and instead just focus on all the positive things. As soon as they do anything positive, throw them a labeled praise for it. And then what they're seeing is that they don't get the attention for the whining, the complaining, whatever else negative is going on. They only get it for the good stuff. So that's special time. My last slide of strategies, and then hopefully I'll have some time for questions. And these strategies they can be used as antecedents, they can be used as consequences. They're just kind of good things to hold in mind. I get so many parents who at the beginning of parenting work say, okay, great, you want me to praise my kids? That would be wonderful if they did anything good. But right now, there just isn't any good behavior. There's nothing good to praise. And the answer to that is, if you don't see anything good to praise, you have to really dig to find it. It's in there. It just might be really hard to see. So it's about catching the good behavior and maybe lowering your expectations of what good is. So what we say is at least 30% correct. If you're trying to get your kid to ask for the cereal more respectfully in the morning and you're not getting any, can I please have some cereal? But maybe you're getting cereal, please. Maybe that's the 30% correct. It's enough that you can say, great job using manners. I love how you tried to stay calm there, whatever behavior it is, whatever value-based behavior you're trying to reinforce. Whatever kind of approximation you can get of that behavior, you reinforce it, more of it's going to come out, and then you'll have more opportunities to kind of build up to the more ideal skill. So 30% correct is good enough for labeled praise. Next up thing to keep in mind is holding compassionate limits. A lot of parents kind of struggle, especially ones that are really positive all the time. It's sort of hard to figure out the balance between being positive and go with the flow and where to hold those limits. So again, I encourage you, when you think about what limits are reasonable, respectful, intentional to hold for your family, think about what your values are. And if your value is respect, then maybe you have a limit around back talk or how someone speaks to you, and that there are certain things that you just simply won't respond to and won't tolerate. And you can say that, kindly and respectfully, that you expect to be spoken to in a certain way. And if you're not spoken to that way, you won't respond. And then as soon as they speak to you that way, great, you lay on the praise for, using more respectful, communication skills. Validating emotions. I mentioned earlier, all emotions are valid. And this is often where a lot of parent-child conflict comes up, is when kids have emotions that feel totally disproportionate, that are surprising or unexpected, and that are connected to really inappropriate behaviors. And so the reality is that you have every right to disapprove of the behaviors that you see, if it's things like hitting or kicking, things that are against the family values or the ground rules or expectations. And the emotion that might be connected with the behavior is always valid, even if you don't understand it. So, maybe your child is, yelling at you in a really inappropriate way. You are still going to get more bang for your buck if you can hone in on the emotion and say, I could see that you're really angry at me, that this play date's over and we got to go home. I see that you're really upset. I understand that you're struggling. You can always validate the emotion, and that doesn't mean that you're approving of the behavior or you're letting it go. But by focusing first on the emotion, it helps to regulate your child enough that maybe they could get to a place of making better decisions. Because remember, when you're dysregulated, you're not accessing your thinking brain. They're not going to hear any kind of correction that you're giving, any kind of guidance around how they should be acting, because they are stuck in their fight or flight brain. So validating the emotions, it's kind of like when you call up a friend and you're like, my spouse is driving me nuts and my kids keep demanding this and my boss just gave me this huge task and I'm super overwhelmed. And your friend says, oh, that sounds really hard. It sounds super overwhelming. I get that. And you're just like, yes, thank you. Someone sees it. Someone gets it. I feel better already. Your friend didn't change anything. Your friend didn't tell you that it was okay that you screamed back at your boss or whatever might have happened that maybe wasn't your best choice. But just by having somebody understand your emotion, you feel better enough that it just takes off some weight. And even more than that, there's neuroscience behind this idea of name it to tame it. Naming the emotion. What happens is when you're really dysregulated, when you're really angry, you're anxious, and you're in fight or flight, and you're not accessing your thinking brain, if you can name that emotion, and it's a great skill to teach your kids how to identify their feelings. If you can say, you are really sad, you are really anxious, you are really angry, then what it does is your verbal skills are all kind of housed in your frontal lobe, the part that's out of access when you're dysregulated. So for somebody to put a word to it, that activates the verbal part of your brain, those verbal skills, which brings your frontal lobe back into access. So it actually helps to get your kid in a more regulated place to make, kind of more sound decisions. So name it to tame it, validate the emotion, even if you don't approve of the behaviors. And then one step further is, I love this phrase, connection before correction. It's often in those heated moments where you just caught your kid, speeding like crazy or doing something, unsafe or disrespectful or whatever the problem might be. And you, in that moment, you feel like, I can't let this go. I have to tell them what they did wrong. They have to understand why it was a problem. And you just want to correct. They're not going to hear it in that moment because they are too dysregulated. So in those moments, if you focus first on connection, then you actually can realign yourselves as a team so that you can think together about how to help the better behavior come out the next time. Again, all behavior has a function. Some need is getting met, even if it's really, ineffectively done. So if you can connect, then you can figure out what's a better way for your child to behave to meet their needs and to help everybody kind of get along better. I lived this one a couple days ago with both of my kids were losing their minds after school. Everybody was just way too upset. And the older one was screaming at me, being totally inappropriate, demanding all these things. And I wanted to be like, don't you talk to me like that, young lady. But I realized the emotions were way too high for anything productive to happen. So even though she was attacking me, I said, everybody stop. We all climbed on the couch and I said, like, we're just going to take 2 minutes to just snuggle here together. And we just all sat on the couch holding each other until everybody's breath started to slow down. Everybody calmed a bit. And then I didn't even have to say anything more. My daughter immediately was in a better place to be like, Mommy, I'm sorry. We patched things up. We moved on with our day. And it took way less time and energy than if I had sat there being like, this is how you need to behave. So connection before correction is a really useful skill. Next up, we talked about how, positive feedback is kind of our goal where we can, but negative feedback is totally welcome in the positive parenting philosophy. There are times that you're going to have to correct or criticize or, do something that might not feel the best, or times that you slip up and you yell or whatever it might be. And that's okay. That's all okay. Your goal, the golden rule, research shows, is balance out any piece of negative feedback with 4 pieces of positive feedback. So if you have to correct something or set a limit that causes friction, fine. If you have 4 pieces of positive feedback, whether it be labeled praise or positive touch or anything that's just like a little moment of connection between you and your child, then you are going to sustain a perfectly secure attachment relationship. Sometimes it's hard to do. You may have days where there's a lot of negative, and so you're kind of working hard to lay on the positive. But if your overall average comes out 4-to-1, you're in really good shape. Next, again, there's going to be those moments where these negative behaviors come out, and the research shows that the best skill you have to reduce a negative behavior that's specifically looking to get your attention being the most reinforcing thing we can give our child. So that's things like whining or complaining or pushing limits or arguing. All those things are to get a reaction out of you. Planned ignoring is often what we recommend, and it often backfires, even though it's what we recommend, because the second that you cave, if you've ignored 90% of the way through and then you cave, that behavior gets reinforced even more. So it's a really challenging one to take on. And I always recommend, if parents want to practice ignoring a behavior until it goes away, because behavior gets worse before it gets better, pick one thing at a time and make sure that you're ready to really ignore fully. The way to help yourself through that is to look for the positive opposites wherever you can. So the positive opposite being whatever you're trying to ignore, whatever the negative behavior is. Maybe it's don't run in the street. You're not going to ignore that one, but let's just take that example for a second. If what you don't want to see is don't run in the street, then what do you want to see? Maybe it's holding your hand in the street or walking on the sidewalk. Whatever you can frame in a positive way, that also helps you be able to set the expectation to use that behavior. It could be, we're going into a parking lot, remember, hold my hand. You've now set the expectation for the desirable behavior, and it gives you the opportunity to praise the opposite. So if you're trying to get your child to stop interrupting you when you're on the phone, usually we only give them negative attention and say, I'm on the phone, you got to stop interrupting me. And they just get attention for when they interrupt, because we're not looking at our child and saying, great job sitting quietly while I'm on the phone. But maybe if that's something you want to work on, then that's the positive opposite for you to look for, the behavior to catch and reinforce, is every 15 seconds you're on the phone doing a little thanks for being quiet. And the last one, and then I'll stop for questions, is pack self-regulation tools on the go. This is helpful for yourself and your child. So this is something, it's an antecedent because you're planning it ahead of time, but then you have it as an opportunity for a consequence to a tough behavior. You can help them regulate and get back to a good place. If you always have in your purse, your briefcase, whatever bag you carry, whatever tools are helpful for you or your child to come back to baseline, whether they like putty or fidgets or, you know, crunchy snacks or something you can always have on hand, then you'll feel good that you're going into any situation with a tool in your belt. Okay. Thank you so much. I know that was a lot of information really fast. I feel like you're going to need to rewatch this on 50% speed to actually catch whatever I said. We have 5 minutes left if anyone has questions. And Lisa, I don't know how to see if there's questions in the chat or if people want to speak out. Lisa, you can guide me on how to do this.
Sure. I think the easiest thing is if anyone has any questions, they can just shout it out. I don't see anything in the chat right now, but if you plunk someone there, something there, I'm happy to pass that along to Caroline. And if there aren't any questions, that's fine too. But certainly if there are, just shout it on out.
Hi, this is Lipe. I have a quick question. Is there a way that we can get a recording of this for our partners?
Yes, recording will be sent out after this talk, I believe.
Thank you.
Hi, Carolyn. I don't know if I've met you, but I'm a new therapist at Sasko River. But my background is teaching, and I've taught 4th grade. And just one little tip that worked very well for me when the child is old enough to understand this is kids would come up to me and say, please, can we have more recess? We have more recess. And why can we have more recess? I'd say, well, now you're whining. And if I give in and give you recess now, then you're going to whine more. So there's no way you're having recess. So explaining to kids who are old enough that, and then of course you have to stick by it. And very quickly they, please, Mr. Hastings, do you think we'd have more recess? And the first time they ask, you go, of course we have more recess because you asked so nicely. And it really eliminates that kind of whining behavior when the kid is old enough to understand that concept.
I love that approach of you're cluing them in on the antecedent behavior consequence model so they get to be a part of it with you. And anytime that your kid is joining you in the process, that you're aligned, that you talk about values together and figure out what values are important to your child and to you, and everyone kind of does it as a family, that can go a long way in getting their buy-in and maybe addressing some of the more challenging behaviors they have, and the confidence on their end to maybe call you out as the parent on some of your challenging behaviors so that everyone's showing each other respect. I see a question in the chat. Special time, any tips on how to transition when it is over, especially for toddlers, early elementary children? Great question. So a couple ways to go about it. One thing is a lot of parents try to overachieve on special time and say 5 minutes a day, that's nothing, I could do more than that. And then what happens is they kind of burn out and get themselves into something they can't sustain. So what I recommend is on your end, if you ever have more than 5 minutes to give to special time, that's great, but you can name it. You can say like, we're starting special time, and at the 5-minute mark, you can say like, okay, that's it for special time today. We'll do this again tomorrow. That's a tip to help with the transition, is remind them of when they're going to get it again. And then they'll be less likely to kind of be concerned or upset about it because they know they're getting it again. But today I have a few extra minutes to play, and you can keep playing, but you don't have to push yourself to use all the pride skills. So that's just one tip for you. But to address this question specifically, it could be, depending on how you've set it up or the time of day, it could be that your child can still play, but maybe you have to move on. So you can again say, special time is over for today. I really enjoy actually taking the last minute of special time as you're wrapping up to say, here are the things that I enjoyed doing with you. I really loved it when we built trains. I thought it was so kind when you shared the caboose with me, and just kind of comment on some of the good things, and that can help ease the transition. When special time is over, maybe it's, I'm going to go and prepare dinner. You can keep playing for a little while. And if you have the transition not require things like cleaning up, maybe other times of day they clean up their toys, but at special time they kind of get a free pass. That can also help to make it something that they want to do every day, and that they don't complain about ending, because now they're ending it looking like they have to go and do something undesirable like cleaning up. So those are a couple of things to keep in mind in that transition. But if you do it consistently, if you do it every day, you may the first few times get complaints in the transition as they're not quite used to it. And maybe they don't totally believe it's going to happen the next day just because it's something new. But if you do it every day for a week or so, you won't get complaints about the transition because they'll trust that you're going to do it again the next day. And we got time for maybe one more question if anybody has anything. All right, well, thank you guys so much. This has been wonderful. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is csegal@saskoriver.com. And I hope this was helpful.
Thank you.
so much, Caroline. This is great.
My pleasure. Bye, everyone.